We rarely think about it in peacetime, but the fact is that the paramount reason our forebears came together in 1900 to secure a commonwealth government was to ensure the safety and freedom of the Australian people. And surely it remains so to this day. It follows that there's no greater responsibility for the Prime Minister of the day and the government than our defence and security as a people. The years leading up to Federation, 1900 when we became a nation, were characterised by expansionism by Germany and France into Australasia, and increasingly assertive Japan defeating Russia in war in 1905, and a general but very well-grounded sense of global uneasiness, leading many nations to prepare for the worst. And the worst broke out only 14 years into the new century in 1914. Our own times are not so dissimilar to the times of our nation's founders. That the world is becoming less stable, less predictable, more dangerous every day is simply obvious. Yet, it seems that almost correspondingly, every day we learn of more bungled defence acquisition programs, lost or cancelled military capabilities, lack of essential personnel, even to the extent of manning the frighteningly modest Royal Australian Navy, and a mind-boggling lack of urgency around supply chain security, the supply chain security that means we can feed ourselves, carry forth our basic business, keep the country going in the event of military disruption, or indeed simply guerrilla disruption of some sort that interferes with our shipping lanes and transport options. Plainly, to borrow from the British Prime Minister at the time of the First World War, all of this is too important to leave to the generals. The Prime Minister, elected by the people and accounted to the people, and his government must embrace his prime responsibility. He must take firm control. It is no use claiming, as I often hear, that there's no constituency for defence and security. How can this be seen as anything other than admitting that securing and maintaining our freedom counts less to governments than winning votes at the next election? Perhaps there is no constituency interested in national defence, and perhaps that's because our governments have had little or no inclination to educate Australians on the multiple threats to global peace and Australia's security in particular. The reality, though, is that leaders lead, whether or not there is a constituency, particularly on something as important as our safety. Even if there is no mass of votes in the short term to be gained from securing Australia's military capabilities, this doesn't mean that there are any votes to be lost in securing them. Honesty, calm reason, and sound analysis is needed, leading to the establishment of awareness and trust. That awareness must include a refocusing on the virtues we as citizens need to embody to maintain our national stability, freedom, and prosperity. One of those virtues is patriotism, or love of our country. The recent extraordinary sentence of death, suspended, nonetheless, sentence of death imposed on an Australian by the Chinese Communist Party should be another powerful reminder of the privilege of living in a society in which the state does not have the right to determine what is right and wrong simply because it has the utterly unchecked power to do so. It seems that we live in a world where those who detest democratic capitalist freedoms are ever more certain of the rightness of their way, while we are ever less sure of our own. We in Australia have a major national debate every year as to whether our nation is even worthy of celebration. Is it any wonder that our military is struggling to fill its many vacancies? History teaches that conviction will win out every time over timidity and self-doubt. Real leadership is now urgently needed to facilitate firm and resolute action, both in terms of national unity and actual material capacity of the sort that is urgently needed and surely owed the Australian people. The unipolar global order that we've taken for granted, particularly since the collapse of the Berlin Wall, in which the US has enjoyed such total dominance, is in reality stretched to breaking point. In case anyone hasn't been paying attention, Donald Trump, who is now a realistic possibility as the next US president, has been consistently promising to minimise the US's involvement in international military activity. That's not the kind of talk a vulnerable middle power country like Australia needs to hear, notwithstanding our long-standing ANZUS treaty. The free world must recognise that only by acting in concert will the democracies have the ability to manage more than one or two significant disruptions at any given time. We must also be realistic. It is highly possible that we will face a situation sometime in the next few years where there are more than one or two major disruptions. There could well be 3 or 4. Furthermore, using AUKUS, which remains a great hope, but nothing more as yet, as a smokescreen for such utter irresponsibility as running down our already weak capabilities is the absolute antithesis of the leadership the nation now needs. If we are not prepared to make sacrifices for our own security, why would we think other nations would make sacrifices for us? But even more, if we don't believe in ourselves, we can hardly expect either our friends or those who appear to intensely dislike us to take us seriously. We owe it to ourselves, to those forebears upon whose shoulders we stand, and to other nations that for so long have seen us as a dependable ally, to lift our game fast. Neville Chamberlain is to this very day often castigated for his inadequacies as a British Prime Minister, as he tried to convince himself and his country that he had secured peace in 1938. Peace in our time was the piece of paper he waved in the air after he'd met Adolf Hitler. It was, of course, a forlorn hope. There was no such thing as peace for Europe for many years after that. But here's the point. It should never be forgotten that Britain, late in the day, did start to face up as a staggering illustration of that. In 1938, the Royal Air Force had less than 100 fighting aeroplanes. By the outbreak of war in September 1939, they had 660, including the famous Hurricanes and Spitfires, enough to hold the Germans, even though the Germans had between 4,000 and 5,000 warplanes at bay. They believed in themselves to wake up just in time. Do we?